My mother didn't even lower her voice when she said it. I know you paid off the $680,000 mortgage, but we're gifting the house to your brother as his graduation present. I was still holding the phone when she added, almost cheerfully, and you're not invited to the party. The room around me went quiet in that sharp, unreal way. Like every year I'd spent saving that house evaporated at once. I turned to my uncle, the only person who knew the truth, and asked, "You want to tell them, or should I?" Because 3 days later, nothing about their big day looked the same. I grew up in a two-story house on a quiet street in Springfield, Missouri, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and every season had its own sound. To most people, that house looked steady white, with a porch light that never quite warmed up the curtains my mother loved to iron. But inside, there was an order you learned early or you suffered for it. My mother, Barbara Stevens, owner of a busy neighborhood restaurant and the unquestioned authority of our home, had a way of turning her version of events into fact. She carried herself like someone who held the family on her shoulders, even when the weight came from choices she refused to face. My father, Stephen Stevens, my quiet, agreeable dad who worked long hours as a mechanic, mostly followed her lead. He rarely pushed back, not even when the truth bent so far it scraped. And then there was Matthew, my younger brother, 4 years behind me, but always miles ahead in my mother's eyes. He got the new backpacks, the weekend trips, the extra tutoring when his grades dipped. I got, "You're strong, you'll figure it out." She said it like praise, but it felt like dismissal wearing cheap perfume. By the time I was 16, I understood the rules. Matthew's needs came first, my father stayed neutral, and my mother ran her household like a stage she refused to step down from. I worked after school, saved for community college, and learned not to ask for things she'd already decided I didn't need. Independence wasn't a choice, it was survival. Years later, when I came home to visit, I opened a kitchen drawer and found a stack of unopened envelopes from the bank. The sight of them, heavy, stamped, ignored, made something in my chest tilt. My parents were months behind on the mortgage. The house was slipping. And my mother, the woman who loved being seen as the hero of every story, hadn't told a soul. That night, I sat in my old bedroom and did the math. I knew what I earned, what I could cut, and what it would cost me. 5 years' worth of payments meant my own life would slow to a crawl, but losing that house would finish them. So I stepped into the space my mother swore she already occupied and carried the weight myself. She never mentioned those payments again, except to take the credit. 3 days after that phone call, I found myself standing under a line of maples at the annual family cookout by Lake of the Ozarks. The air smelt like charcoal and sunscreen, the same mix I'd grown up with. But this year, something in the atmosphere felt tilted, like everyone else had received a script I'd never seen. I spotted Matthew, my younger brother, laughing with the cluster of cousins who already spoke as if the house were his. When he moves in, he should redo the yard. It's such a great starter home. Starter home. The words landed like gravel in my mouth. Across the picnic tables, my mother, Barbara, stood near the grill, waving her hands as she told a story I'd heard versions of for years. "It was brutal keeping the place afloat," she said to Aunt Linda and two neighbors. "But you know me, I pushed through. I wasn't about to let that house slip away." All I could do was stare at her. The confidence, the convenience, the absolute certainty that everyone would accept her version without blinking. And they did. Heads nodded. Someone patted her shoulder. No one asked who actually wrote the checks. My father, Stephen, hovered behind her, quiet as always, adding just enough supportive hums to make it seem like he remembered things the same way. I felt my jaw tighten. 5 years of payments had emptied entire seasons of my life, late nights, skipped trips, worn-out shoes, and she stood there spinning a myth polished enough to shine. Then came the real blow. My cousin, Kate Lane, who worked with financial services, pulled me aside. She lowered her voice. "Your mom's already trying to move the house into Matthew's name," she whispered. "But there's a problem. The trust your Uncle James set up, it's blocking everything." The world sharpened. The trust. The one I barely remember signing. The one my uncle pushed for just in case. I looked across the field to where Uncle James sat at a picnic table, watching the crowd with that level, patient expression he wore when he'd already done the math long before anyone else caught on. I walked to the folder I'd brought tucked under my arm. I hadn't planned to use it. I'd brought it the way you bring an umbrella when the sky threatens to split open. When I reached his side, I laid the folder on the table and flipped it open. Payments, bills, the trust pages, with my name tied to every obligation. Conversations around us quieted one ripple at a time. James cleared his throat. Rebecca, are you sure? I wasn't sure about much, but I was done disappearing. I turned toward him, my voice low and steady. I asked, "You want to tell them, or should I?" His eyes met mine, and that was the moment everything shifted.
The night after the cookout, I drove to my parents' house, expecting tension, maybe a clipped conversation at the doorway. I didn't expect the silence that greeted me, a strange, hollow quiet that felt staged. The porch light flickered the way it always had, but when I slipped my key into the lock, it hit metal and refused to turn. I tried again. Nothing. Then the door opened just a few inches, and Matthew, my younger brother, filled the gap. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't apologizing. He just stared at me like I was a problem he'd been warned about. "Mom said you should call first," he muttered. I held up my useless key. "You changed the lock?" He didn't deny it. Didn't even flinch. "This place is kind of in transition right now." Transition. As if the house I'd kept alive was shedding me like old paint. Behind him, I saw moving boxes. His. My parents stood farther back in the hallway, not close enough to engage, but close enough to witness. My mother's expression was unreadable, but my father's eyes dropped the moment mine rose to find his. "Matthew," I said quietly. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. I pushed past him into the house, a place that should have been mine, but now felt foreign. The sound of my footsteps echoed in a way that made the house feel more like a stranger's home than ever before. My mother stepped forward, eyes wide with false cheer. "We're just getting things settled, honey," she said, as though nothing had changed. "Settled," I repeated, my voice a low whisper. "You're selling the house behind my back." She crossed her arms, shaking her head. "It's not like that. You know we've always planned for Matthew to take over." "But he didn't pay for it," I said, the words coming out like a clenched fist. Her lips trembled, but her resolution remained firm. "It doesn't matter. It's the way things are. He's the one who'll appreciate it." I felt my stomach churn as she spoke, as though I wasn't even in the room, as though I'd never spent 5 years of my life carrying the weight of this house on my back. But it didn't matter now. "It matters legally," Patrick O'Neill, the attorney I'd brought with me, interrupted, stepping forward. "Mrs. Stevens." The night after the cookout, I drove to my parents' house, expecting tension, maybe a clipped conversation at the doorway. I didn't expect the silence that greeted me, a strange, hollow quiet that felt staged. The porch light flickered the way it always had, but when I slipped my key into the lock, it hit metal and refused to turn. I tried again. Nothing. Then the door opened just a few inches, and Matthew, my younger brother, filled the gap. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't apologizing. He just stared at me like I was a problem he'd been warned about. "Mom said you should call first," he muttered. I held up my useless key. "You changed the lock?" He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. "This place is kind of in transition right now." Transition. As if the house I'd kept alive was shedding me like old paint. Behind him, I saw moving boxes. His. My parents stood further back in the hallway, not close enough to engage, but close enough to witness. My mother's expression was unreadable, but my father's eyes dropped the moment mine rose to find his. "Matthew," I said quietly. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. I pushed past him into the house, a place that should have been mine, but now felt foreign. The sound of my footsteps echoed in a way that made the house feel more like a stranger's home than ever before. My mother stepped forward, eyes wide with false cheer. "We're just getting things settled, honey," she said, as though nothing had changed. "Settled?" I repeated, my voice a low whisper. "You're selling the house behind my back." She crossed her arms, shaking her head. "It's not like that. You know we've always planned for Matthew to take over." "But he didn't pay for it," I said, the words coming out like a clenched fist. Her lips trembled, but her resolve remained firm. "It doesn't matter. It's the way things are. He's the one who'll appreciate it." I felt my stomach churn as she spoke, as though I wasn't even in the room, as though I'd never spent 5 years of my life carrying the weight of this house on my back. But it didn't matter now. "It matters legally," Patrick O'Neill, the attorney I'd brought with me, interrupted, stepping forward. Mrs. Stevens, the trust was created years ago to protect this property. At the time, you agreed that the individual making the payments would have final authority. That individual is Rebecca. My father, Stephen, slipped onto the porch, rubbing the back of his neck like he wanted to disappear. "Let's just calm down," he muttered. But he wasn't talking to my mother. He was talking to himself. My mother pointed a shaking hand at Patrick. "We didn't mean for that to be permanent." "That's not how trust agreements work," Patrick replied gently, "and your attempt to transfer the house behind her back triggered the review." Murmurs spurred among relatives, forming a semicircle on the lawn. My cousin, Kate, whispered loudly, "Wait, Rebecca paid the mortgage?" Another cousin frowned. "For years? And nobody said anything?" My mother's lips were trembling now, not with guilt, but with the realization that her story was slipping. "That trust was for emergencies," she insisted. "It wasn't supposed to give her control." Uncle James took one small step forward, his voice calm but unshakable. "Barbara, I set up that trust because you and Stephen were drowning. You signed it willingly and Rebecca saved your home. If she hadn't stepped in when she did, the bank would have taken everything." My mother blinked rapidly. Anger, panic, and denial fighting for space. "This is still our house," she said, almost pleading. "I protected it," I answered softly. "I just didn't realize you'd erase me to do it." She turned to my father as if searching for backup, but he dropped his gaze. For once, even he couldn't pretend. Patrick opened the folder I'd handed him earlier. He said, "Under the trust, Miss Stevens may decide how the property is handled. What happens now is her choice." My mother looked at me like I'd pulled the floor out from under her. "What? What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm enforcing boundaries, something I should have done years ago." Behind her, I saw the hallway, the same hallway where I dropped my backpack as a kid, the same place I'd heard whispered arguments about money, the same path that now led to Matthew's boxes stacked like trophies he hadn't earned. "This house won't be transferred," I continued. "You'll have a set amount of time to move to the rental you signed for." "You're kicking us out?" Matthew burst out, disbelief cracking his voice. "After everything Mom did for you?" The irony almost made me laugh. "Instead," I breathed, "I'm not kicking anyone out," I said. "I'm following the agreement Mom signed, the one that gives me responsibility and authority." "I'm your mother," Barbara snapped suddenly, her voice breaking. "You can't do this to me." "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. "You did." The tow truck pulled away with Matthew's car. A balloon string snapped and drifted into the air. A banner that read, "Congrats," fluttered as people began leaving early, pretending they'd forgotten something at home. The perfect day my mother had imagined, her triumphant story, had collapsed under the weight of the truth she'd tried so hard to bury. Barbara took a small, unsteady step backward. My father caught her elbow. Matthew stood still, finally silent. I turned to leave with James and Patrick, the breeze carrying the faint rustle of the banner behind me. Their big day wasn't ruined. It was rewritten. In the weeks that followed, everything settled into a quieter, truer shape. The property review confirmed exactly what Patrick had predicted. The trust stood firm. Every payment I'd made over 5 years was accounted for, and the house, legally and practically, shifted fully under my authority. There were no dramatic hearings, no shouting matches, no last-minute twists. Just paperwork, signatures, and a clarity my family had avoided for years. My mother, Barbara, and my father, Stephen, moved into a modest rental on the other side of Springfield. Not out of punishment, but because the trust no longer allowed them to treat the house as a prop in a story that erased me. Even my mother didn't argue with the deadline. She packed quietly, her voice thin whenever we crossed paths. My father kept his head down, helping her carry boxes to the car. Matthew, stripped of the house and the car he'd assumed were waiting for him, took a job at a local warehouse. For the first time in his life, people expected things from him he couldn't charm his way out of. When I drove past him one afternoon, he didn't wave. He just stared at the pavement like it finally asked something of him too. As for me, I took slow ownership of the house. I fixed the creaking step on the porch,
repainted the kitchen, opened windows that hadn't been touched in years. It felt strange at first, claiming something I'd protected for so long but never truly believed could be mine. Strange and peaceful. Standing in that house now, I finally understand something I spent years avoiding. Protecting yourself isn't betrayal. It's the first honest form of love you learn when the people who should have cared for you choose comfort over truth. I didn't win a victory over my family. I simply stepped out of the shadow they kept me in. If you've ever carried everything alone or been written out of your own story, you're not alone. Share your experience in the comments and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.